There is a quiet kind of pain nobody warns you about. It doesn't arrive with chaos or drama. It arrives slowly, almost politely. One day, you look around and realize the people who once felt like home now feel familiar, but distant. Not because anything went wrong, not because of a fight, but because something inside you changed. And the hardest part is this: you didn't leave them behind on purpose. You just kept growing. Outgrowing people doesn't feel like winning. It feels like betrayal, even when no one says it out loud. Because growth is supposed to be celebrated, right? That's what everyone tells you. Level up, move forward, become more. But no one talks about the guilt that comes with becoming someone new, while others stay the same. At first, it's subtle. You notice conversations feel repetitive. The jokes don't land the way they used to. The dreams you talk about are met with silence or polite nods or quick subject changes. You start editing yourself, shrinking your thoughts, downplaying your progress. Not because you're arrogant, but because you don't want to make anyone uncomfortable. And that's where the guilt begins, because a part of you wonders, am I changing too much? Am I becoming someone they can't recognize anymore? Am I leaving people behind just by moving forward? Here's the truth. Most people never say out loud. Outgrowing others doesn't mean you think you're better than them. It means you're no longer the same version of yourself that fit comfortably into the old dynamic. And dynamics don't break loudly. They fade. You used to bond over the same struggles, the same fears, the same frustrations. But now, you're solving problems they're still stuck inside. You're asking questions they're avoiding. You're choosing discomfort in a way they're not ready for. And suddenly you feel like the odd one out, even though you're the one who changed. So you start feeling responsible. Responsible for the distance, responsible for the silence, responsible for the shift. But growth doesn't ask for permission, it just happens. And still, the guilt stays. Because when you grow, you don't just gain clarity, you gain awareness. You become aware of patterns you once tolerated. You notice emotional loops you once laughed off. You see behaviors you once normalized and can no longer ignore. And that awareness creates separation, not physically at first, but emotionally. You're still in the same room, but you're no longer in the same place. And the worst part? You miss them. You miss who they were to you. You miss who you were with them. You miss the version of yourself that didn't overthink every interaction. That didn't feel guilty for dreaming bigger. That didn't feel like growth came with loss. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. Growth always costs something. Sometimes it costs comfort. Sometimes it costs certainty. And sometimes it costs people. But society romanticizes growth. It shows the highlight reel, the success, the confidence, the glow up. It rarely shows the quiet nights where you wonder if you've become too different to belong anywhere. You start asking questions like, why do I feel lonely even when I'm doing better? Why do I feel guilty for wanting more? Why does success sometimes feel heavier than failure? And the answer isn't that you're ungrateful. It's that growth separates before it unites. When you outgrow others, you enter a strange emotional space. You're no longer who you were, but not fully surrounded by people who match who you're becoming. So you float, and floating feels lonely. You don't fit into old conversations, but you don't yet feel fully at home in new ones. And because you're empathetic, because you care, because you remember where you came from, you feel guilty for the distance, even when it wasn't intentional. But here's something important you need to hear. Outgrowing others is not an act of cruelty. It's a consequence of self-respect. When you start choosing honesty over comfort, growth over familiarity, self-awareness over avoidance, some relationships simply can't follow, not because the people are bad, but because the relationship was built for a version of you that no longer exists. And that realization hurt, because you don't want to hurt anyone. You didn't wake up one day and decide to leave. You just stopped abandoning yourself, and that changed everything. There's a reason this guilt feels so heavy. It's because humans are wired for belonging. For most of history, being cast out meant danger. Isolation wasn't emotional, it was survival. So when growth threatens connection, your nervous system interprets it as loss. Even if your mind knows you're evolving, Your body feels like it's losing safety. That's why you second guess yourself. That's why you wonder if you should slow down. That's why you sometimes consider shrinking back, just to keep the peace. But peace that requires self-betrayal is not peace. It's postponement. And eventually, the cost becomes too high. You start feeling drained after conversations that once energized you. You feel misunderstood even when you're heard. You feel like you're explaining yourself too much, or not at all. And that's when the guilt transforms into grief. Because you're not just losing people, you're grieving shared futures that will never happen, plans that once felt certain, inside jokes that no longer land, dreams that no longer align. You're mourning something invisible. And invisible grief is the hardest to explain, especially when nothing bad happened. No betrayal, no explosion, just evolution. And yet the guilt whispers, shouldn't I stay loyal? Shouldn't I be grateful? Shouldn't I try harder to keep things the same? But here's the quiet truth most people learn too late. Staying the same to protect others eventually turns into resentment. And resentment slowly erodes love. You start showing up less, listening less, caring less. Not because you stopped caring, but because you're tired of being somewhere you've already outgrown. And that version of you deserves honesty. Growth doesn't mean you forget where you came from. It means you honor it without letting it trap you. And yes, some people will feel left behind. Not because you abandoned them, but because they chose familiarity over transformation. That doesn't make them wrong. It just makes your paths different. The guilt you feel isn't a sign you're doing something wrong. It's a sign you're human. It means you care deeply. It means you're emotionally aware. It means you didn't discard people casually. But caring doesn't mean staying stuck. And here's something rarely talked about. Sometimes people don't miss you. They miss access to the version of you that made them comfortable. The version that didn't challenge them. The version that didn't change the dynamic. The version that stayed predictable. And when that version disappears, it creates discomfort. But discomfort isn't harm. It's an invitation. Some will rise to meet it, some won't. And that's not your responsibility to control. The guilt of outgrowing others often comes from a false belief that your growth invalidates theirs, but growth isn't a competition. Your evolution doesn't erase anyone's worth. It simply reveals alignment, or the lack of it. And alignment matters more than history, because history alone cannot sustain connection. Only shared direction can. You can love people deeply and still accept that they cannot walk where you're going. You can honor memories without forcing a future that no longer fits. And you can feel guilt without letting it decide your life. Because if you shrink to keep others comfortable, you don't save the relationship. You just lose yourself quietly. And losing yourself is a far heavier loss. In the next part, we'll talk about what to do with this guilt, how to release it without becoming cold, how to grow without becoming detached, and how to let go without turning growth into loneliness. Because outgrowing others is not the end of connection, it's the beginning of a more honest one. Starting with yourself. And here's the part no one really prepares you for. Once you accept that you've outgrown certain people, the guilt doesn't disappear overnight. It changes shape. At first it's loud, it asks questions, it keeps you awake. But eventually it becomes quieter and deeper. It shows up when you're doing well and suddenly think of someone who isn't there anymore. It shows up when you laugh at something new and realize the old group wouldn't understand why it matters to you now. It shows up when you want to share a win, then stop yourself. Not because you're ashamed, but because you don't want to create distance where there already is some. This is the guilt of growth, not because growth is wrong, but because it changes the emotional map of your life. And the most confusing part is that no one is at fault. There's no villain, no betrayal, no moment you can point to and say, that's when everything broke. Things didn't break, they shifted, and humans struggle with shifts more than endings. Endings are clear, shifts are ambiguous. When a relationship ends clearly, the mind can categorize it. But when it slowly fades, your heart keeps trying to revive it. You replay conversations, you wonder if you should reach out more. You ask yourself if you're being distant or just different. And that internal conflict creates a quiet exhaustion. Because part of you wants to honor who you are becoming, and another part wants to protect who you used to be with them. This is where many people get stuck. They try to carry both versions of themselves at the same time. They show up halfway, They speak carefully. They avoid topics that matter to them. They pretend they haven't changed as much as they have. And over time, that split becomes painful. Because authenticity is not optional for emotional health, you can fake enthusiasm for only so long. You can hide your growth for only so long. Eventually, something gives. And often, what gives is your sense of peace. Here's something important to understand. Outgrowing others doesn't mean you stop loving them. It means the way you love them has to change. Love doesn't always mean proximity. It doesn't always mean daily presence. Sometimes love means acceptance without attachment, and that is one of the hardest forms of love. Because attachment feels like proof. It feels like loyalty. It feels like safety. But attachment can also quietly demand that you stay small. Not because others intend it, but because familiarity resists disruption. When you grow, you disrupt. Not aggressively, not intentionally, just by becoming more honest about who you are. And honesty changes dynamics. Some people will lean in. They'll grow curious. They'll ask questions. They'll evolve alongside you. Others will pull away, sometimes silently, not out of malice, but because growth confronts comfort. And comfort is powerful. So the guilt you feel isn't because you hurt anyone. It's because you're confronting a truth many people avoid. That not everyone who started with you can come with you. And that truth feels lonely, even when it's necessary. But here's where perspective matters. Think about how many versions of yourself you've already outgrown. The child you once were, the beliefs you once held, the fears you once obeyed. You don't feel guilty for outgrowing those versions. You feel grateful, because growth requires leaving something behind. And relationships are no different. They are living systems. They either adapt or they stay tied to a moment in time. When you outgrow others, it doesn't mean you're superior. It means your inner world expanded. You began asking deeper questions. You became more aware of patterns. You started aligning your actions with your values. And that expansion created a gap that guilt tries to fill with responsibility. But you are not responsible for managing everyone else's comfort. You are responsible for living honestly. And honesty does not require cruelty. It requires clarity. Clarity sounds like this. I care about you, even if we don't connect the same way anymore. I appreciate what we shared, even if we're growing differently now. I'm not leaving, I'm evolving. But even if you never say those words out loud, you can live them quietly. By letting go of the urge to over-explain. By releasing the need to be understood by everyone. By allowing relationships to find their natural distance. This is where guilt begins to soften. Not because you stop caring, but because you stop blaming yourself for change. You realize something freeing. You didn't outgrow them overnight, and they didn't lose you suddenly. You grew slowly. They stayed where they were, and both can be true without either being wrong. What hurts most is not the growth itself. It's the idea that growth has to mean loss. But it doesn't always. Sometimes it means transformation. Some relationships evolve into something quieter, less frequent, but still meaningful. Others fade completely, and that's painful, but not immoral. And some surprise you. They reconnect later when growth has reshaped both sides. Life is not linear. Distance now does not guarantee distance forever, but forcing closeness will guarantee resentment. So if you're feeling guilty for outgrowing others, ask yourself this. Am I honoring my growth or apologizing for it? Because growth doesn't need permission. And it certainly doesn't need constant justification. You don't owe stagnation to anyone. You owe honesty to yourself. There's another layer to this guilt that rarely gets addressed. Sometimes, outgrowing others triggers a fear. What if I end up alone? When familiar relationships fade, the mind looks ahead and sees uncertainty. New connections aren't guaranteed. Belonging feels fragile. So the guilt whispers, maybe it's safer to go back. But safety without alignment is slow erosion. You might not notice it immediately, but over time you begin to feel disconnected from your own life. You show up, but you're not present. You speak, but you're filtered. You smile, but something feels off. And that internal dissonance costs more than loneliness ever will. Because loneliness can be temporary. Self-abandonment leaves a deeper mark. Growth asks for courage, not just to change, but to tolerate the space that change creates. That space is where new understanding forms, new connections emerge, new versions of belonging appear. but only if you don't rush to fill it with the past. The guilt of outgrowing others is not something to eliminate. It's something to understand. It's the emotional residue of empathy colliding with evolution. And that's not a flaw, it's evidence of depth. So instead of asking, how do I stop feeling guilty? Ask this instead. How do I grow with compassion without shrinking myself? The answer lies in balance, in honoring what was without clinging to it, in appreciating people without forcing proximity, in choosing growth without turning cold. You can wish people well from afar. You can remember them warmly. You can still care without carrying them. And that is not abandonment. That is maturity. Outgrowing others is not a failure of loyalty. It's a sign that your inner world is evolving faster than your environment. And while that can feel isolating, it is also the beginning of deeper alignment. With people who see you as you are now, with conversations that stretch you, with connections that don't require you to explain your growth. So if you're carrying guilt right now, let this land gently. You didn't become distant to hurt anyone. You became honest with yourself, and that honesty deserves space. Growth will always change who walks beside you, but it will also bring you closer to who you are. And in the end, that is not something to feel guilty about. It's something to respect.